Okay, today's teaching is, were there Jewish temples on the Temple Mount? Where the Dome of the Rock currently sits, is that where the temples were? And it's such an easily answered question. Unfortunately, so many people do not know the answer to this because of deceptive preachers, pseudo-scholars, and many other swindlers. Every few years or so since I was a kid, this same question gets asked in churches all over the world. Jews, of course, know better, but Christians are swayed by every wind of doctrine. They wonder if it's true, or if it at least has some merit, and it's all very, very interesting to them. Okay? It's not interesting to me at all. At all. In fact, I'll echo Dr. Yuval Baruch, who was a leading Israeli archaeologist who has studied Jerusalem throughout his career and is the regional archaeologist for Jerusalem for the Israeli Department of Antiquities. He said, "I feel stupid even having to comment on it." And I agree. He further stated, demanding proof that the temple stood on the mount, on the Temple Mount, is like demanding proof that the ancient stone walls surrounding Jerusalem, which stand to this day, were the ancient stone walls surrounding Jerusalem. That's how silly it is. Mm-hmm. To me, it's like arguing with the people that believe in the flat earth theory. Pretty much the same thing. You guys know about flat earth theory? They think the earth is flat. It's just so incredibly ridiculous. So the reason why am I even talking about it? Because there are people out there that believe this nonsense. So what do we say to these poor souls who believe that the temples of both Solomon and Herod did not stand where they obviously stood? Well, first, when you talk to these people, they have to be open to the truth. Mm-hmm. That goes for anything you try to tell them. Right. If they want to think that the world is flat and that it lies on the back of a giant kitty cat, then you're not going to change their mind if they want to believe that. Mm-hmm. The scriptures testify to the earth being round. Isaiah 40:22. It is he who sits above the what? Circle of the earth. That tells us it's round, doesn't it? And its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, there's also pictures of the earth to kind of show that it's round.
From space.
Right.
Come on.
Or you can go outside and look at the sun or the moon and see that they're round. My dad was friends with Buzz Aldrin. Buzz saw the earth from the moon with his own eyes. But of course that's not enough for the conspiracy theorists who find the flat earth theory to be very, very interesting. Stupid. So the idea that the Temple Mount is not where the Dome of the Rock currently sits has been going around in different forms for a long time. I watched my dad battle it in churches for many, many years. One of the theories back then said that it didn't sit exactly where the Dome of the Rock currently sits, but actually right next to it. They even had some graphics like this to show what it would look like if the temple was rebuilt now. This idea was put out with taglines from Americans such as, "The Muslims and Jews can quit fighting now because of this breakthrough information, and they can now live together in peace."
Yeah, right.
These ideas are conceived by people who want to make a name for themselves, and they can't do it via legitimate scholarship. New ideas can be great, but they have to be done within particular boundaries. For example, I can't just say, Jerusalem is now in Ghana. Isn't that very, very interesting? Right? I have to move within logical boundaries. Even the Muslims have known up until recently that the Jewish temple sat on the site of the Temple Mount. This is in a brief guide to Al-Haram al-Sharif, published in English by the Supreme Muslim Council in 1925, and it states, "The site is one of the oldest in the world. Its sanctity dates from the earliest perhaps from prehistoric times. Its identity with the site of Solomon's temple is beyond dispute. The first temple was built by King Solomon on the Temple Mount. It was destroyed by the Babylonians, who expelled us from the land. That was in about 587 BC. When we were allowed to return from exile, some decades later, we built a new temple on the very same site, but it was a simple structure. Our makeshift effort was not to the taste of King Herod, who swept away the shabby house of worship, created a great platform on top of the mount. There was already a platform. He expanded it, and he had the grand second temple erected on it within a massive compound. The second temple was destroyed and looted by the Romans in 70 AD under Emperor Vespasian. Now, how much of that can be proved? Almost all of it. Almost all of it. Welcome, welcome. Professor Israel Finkelstein, a world-renowned expert on Jerusalem archaeology, spelled out in an email to the Haaretz newspaper, quote, "There is no scholarly school of thought that doubts the existence of the first temple. Concrete finds definitively from the temple exist in abundance." Professor Gabi Barkai, who I've dug with many times, has spent many years working in Jerusalem, and the area of the Temple Mount in particular, and he said this: 2 copies of inscriptions prohibiting the entry of non-believers to the temple have been found on the Temple Mount, which Josephus wrote about. These inscriptions were on the dividing wall that surrounded the second temple, which prevented non-Jews from accessing the interior of the temple courtyard. Both were written in ancient Greek. The others as well, but they also had Greek on it. The Warning Stone, that's what they call it, the Warning Stone, which is at the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, warns non-Jews of the perils of entering the sacred temple. There were additional similar inscriptions in Latin, he said. So they found these things right on the Temple Mount. So we know that it was there. I'm going to give you like 5 reasons in this teaching so you know that this is where it was built and so forth. There's at least 30 or 40 different reasons I could give. We could do a whole series on this. I'm not going to, but we could do a whole series on this. There's so much evidence. What the latest myth that is going around is saying is that the temple was actually cleared down by the Gihon Springs. So if you look on the thing, see where the Gihon Springs is? They're saying this latest idea that's coming out is that it's at the Gihon Springs, way down here at the city of David. See, this looks kind of like a finger here. You see that? This is where they say the real Temple Mount is, which makes absolutely no sense at all whatsoever. So here they're saying this where the real temple was, not up there on the Temple Mount. So it's down here in what's called the city of David. Some put it there. Yeah, I'll show you. I got a map for it. So the new theory says that the Antonia Fortress took up all the area where the temple is today. They're saying that where the temple was. They're saying the temple wasn't there. It was actually this huge Roman fort, the Antonia Fortress. The Antonia Fortress is where the Roman soldiers lived. We both agree on that. Thing is, when they discovered this, when they were digging at this area up on the Temple Mount, 50 mikvahs were found there.
Wow.
50. So why would all these Roman soldiers need all these mikvahs? It makes absolutely no sense. This is a picture of a mikvah found at the foot of the western wall itself. Another inscription in stone was found. This is a different stone. And it said, "To the trumpeting place." It was found in 1968 at the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. Notice it was written in 1st century Hebrew. Well, what does that mean? To the trumpeting place. It is known that trumpets were blown at the corners of the Temple Mount to declare the advent of Shabbat and other dates. Josephus, the ancient historian, explains that it was customary for a temple priest to, quote, stand and to give notice by sound of trumpet in the afternoon of the approach and on the following evening of the close of every seventh day.
Wow.
The stone, by the way, is now at the Israeli Museum. So the next big part of their argument is, how does one explain Herodian stones in the Wailing Wall? One individual wrote me and he said, Jesus swore that no stone would remain on another. Are you saying the master is lying? I never was given the opportunity to give the answer to this question, but it is a common question put forth by those who believe in it or give it any kind of validity. This is what they're referring to. Yeshua left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. You see all these things, he asked. Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. So what they're saying, what he's saying is that how can there be a Wailing Wall still intact when Yeshua said that the whole thing would be torn down? Well, notice carefully what it says. It says, these buildings. These buildings. So it was talking about the temple and the surrounding buildings. The Kotel, the Wailing Wall, is not a building. Okay? It is a retaining wall. Here's a mountain peak. You have a mountain peak like this. Mount Zion. You can't build on a peak. It's got a point. So he had to make retaining walls all the way around it, fill it up with dirt so you had a nice big level spot. Then you have a platform that you can build on. In 70 AD, the buildings on top of that were torn apart and thrown down, but the retaining walls still remain. Here's some of those stones that were thrown down. If you look over here, those are stones that were in the temple that were pulled apart and thrown down. So this new theory is being pushed by a man named Ernest Martin. He wrote The Temples That Jerusalem Forgot. I kind of find some irony in his first name, Ernest, because I don't think he's very earnest at all. So even though it's a new theory, it's really not new at all. This book was first published back in 1994. Okay? All he did is he repackaged it and he made it sound new. So let's look at his theory again and a few other things that he has said. Again, the theory, the main thrust behind his idea is that the location of the temple is over the Gihon Spring. He equates Zion with the site of the temple and begins by stating that Zion was limited to the southern end of the southeastern ridge of Jerusalem. The temple was built there, he claims, because of the Gihon Spring. The Bible even indicated that the temple was abutting to the northern side of the city of David, writes Martin. Further, he alleges that David placed the Ark of the Covenant over the Gihon Spring, quoting Psalms 87, which says, all my springs are in thee. That could mean a lot of different things. He also quotes Psalms 116. I will pay my vows unto the Lord now in the presence of all his people, in the courts of the Lord's house, within the temple, in the midst, and he makes a big deal out of this, says what it should say is center of thee, O Jerusalem. Martin tries to derive further support for his theory from the book of Revelation, where we are told that those who were thirsty could drink from the fountain or the spring of water that issued from the New Jerusalem that would come down from heaven to earth. He then moves on to the prophecy of Yeshua, who, according to his interpretation, told his disciples, this is what we just talked about, that not one stone of the temple and its support buildings would be left on top of the other. He theorizes that all the walls of the temple and the Temple Mount were torn down to their foundations, just as Yeshua prophesied. Only the Antonia fortress, which he equates with the Herodian Temple Mount, escaped destruction of AD 70. Martin then interprets Josephus, who said that the Temple Mount was a precise square of one stadium length on each side of about 600 feet. The southeastern corner of the outer temple wall was, according to Martin, located directly over the very bottom of the Kidron Valley, the bedrock center, and extended upwards 300 cubits or 450 feet. He also talks about the western wall, where we pray, many Jews pray today. He also gives that a very rough treatment. Says that's not where Jews prayed in history. The weakness of this proposal lies in the fact that it consists mainly of Martin's personal interpretation of some Bible passages and historical references. It does not refer to the results of archaeological excavations in Jerusalem since 1967. So first we want to ask ourselves, where is the city of David? He's saying this is the Gihon Spring in the city of David. Well, I kind of showed you a little bit of it before. You can see there's the Gihon Springs there. Okay? And everyone agrees that that's the city of David, and that's where the Gihon Spring is. We agree on that part. Here's what it looks like today. Okay, so that whole part up there was the Temple Mount. He says that's not the Temple Mount. He's saying the Gihon Spring, which is right here, that this is actually where the temple sat, not up there. So again, you can see this kind of a finger. Whenever we think of the city of David, it kind of looks like a finger. So it's down here in the valley, in the Kidron Valley, right there near the bottom. You can also see from this picture that the city of David is also part of Mount Zion. You can kind of even tell from the way it goes down. This whole mountain here is Mount Zion. So the Gihon Spring is a part of the city of David. Archaeologists have even found the fortification walls around the Gihon Spring. That's the fortification they had around it because they had to protect their only water source. You see that little extra bit there, the fortification? Because that's where the spring was. You had to protect your water. David captured this area from the Jebusites and called it the city of David. You can find that in 2 Samuel 5:7. When Solomon finished building the temple, he brought the Ark of the Covenant, it says, out of the city of David, which is Zion. You can find that in 1 Kings 8:1. You see the issue here? There's a major issue here. It says he took it out of the city of David. Right? Well, if you took it out of the city of David, let's go back to our picture. If you took it out of the city of David, then he's taking it out of where the Gihon Spring is. You see that? So obviously the temple cannot be within the city of David.
Right.
Make sense? So this makes it quite clear that the temple was located outside of the city of David. But Martin either ignores or isn't aware of this little known passage. I tend to think he's not aware of it, because what it does is it destroys his entire theory. I'd also add this, among many other things. David built an altar on the place where the angel stood, overlooking the city of David. You guys remember that story? There was an angel that came, and he stood over, and he was going to destroy Jerusalem, right? And it says he stood outside the city of David on higher ground in 2 Samuel 24:16. I didn't put that up there. 2 Samuel 24:16. So David built an altar at this place, which is also was where the threshing floor of Araunah was. It's on a threshing floor. You might remember that part as well. Well, one thing is threshing floors are never found inside of cities or in valleys. They're always on the mountaintops. Why would that be?
For the wind to blow.
For the
chaff.
wind, exactly. It's always where the wind, because that's where the wind is. That's where the wind will blow away the chaff. The temple, therefore, had to be built outside of the city of David and higher up on the mountain. So not way down in the city of David, way down in the valley, right? Because that's where, we'll find out here in a minute, where this threshing floor is also where he built an altar to the Lord, and that's where the temple was built. So it's not way down in the city of David, but up on the peak of Har Zion. Jerusalem had its beginnings on this southeast hill, but then it later spread to the north. Psalms 48:2 says, beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion, on the sides of the north, the city of the great king. And that is misunderstood by Martin. The passage does not mean that the temple abutted the city of David, and David understood that, and he understood where the temple was going to be built, and that it had to be located in the place where he had built an earlier altar, to the north of the city of David. That's what it means on the sides of the north. This is south. You go above here, where are you going? You're going north. This is the sides of the north. That's what that passage is talking about. The word for situation there in Psalms 48 actually means elevation, as the Hebrew verb noth means to lift up, indicating that the temple site was located in an elevated position in relation to the city of David, not in a lower position. Martin's position in Psalms 87:7, which says, all my springs are in thee, that it means that Solomon's temple was built over a spring, is incorrect. The Hebrew for springs can also mean eyes. This verse should more correctly be interpreted to mean that God's eyes are always on Jerusalem. Continuing in the spring context, Martin compares the above verse to a spring that will be found in the future temple. However, he forgets that waters will flow out through the Mount of Olives. You guys know the story. He comes down, he touches the Mount of Olives. Mount of Olives splits, and huge amounts of water come out, right? This water comes out and goes clear down to the Dead Sea. There's so much water that it clears the Dead Sea of all of the salt. You guys, I've taught on that before. Do you guys remember that? Okay. Well, think about that. Think about that. In order for water to flow through the Mount of Olives, this huge amount of water, let's go back to the map here. Remember, this is down in the valley. The Gihon Spring is down here in the valley. This is the Mount of Olives. If it splits and this huge amount of water comes out, guess what happens here? It'll kill everybody in the temple. It has to be in a higher ground. You can't be way down here at the very bottom of the valley. It'll kill everybody. Kills all the good guys. It's so ludicrous. Incredibly ludicrous. So, in order for water to flow through the Mount of Olives means that the temple must be located on higher ground, opposite the Mount of Olives, not in the lower city of David. Otherwise, the new temple would be submerged and everybody would drown. Martin's quote from Psalms 116, in the midst or the center of thee, O Jerusalem, does not mean that the temple was located in the center of Jerusalem, but merely inside of it, in the midst of it. Doesn't have to be dead center. The Hebrew for in the midst, bet tavech, is usually translated as among, when referring to the people, or in the midst, meaning within. when referring to places like a garden, a city, or the sea. In the English Bible, it has never once been translated as center. He's trying to say it's right dead in the center. Let's talk about the Antonia Fortress now. To accommodate his theory, Martin claims, this is the guy that wrote this book back in 1994. He claims that the Herodian Temple Mount walls do not belong to the Temple Mount, but to the Antonia Fortress. This idea, though, is untenable because Josephus said that Titus had, quote, ordered the troops that were with him to raise the foundations of Antonia, an undertaking that took 7 days to complete. You can look that up. The size of the Temple Mount is approximately 10 times that of what the Antonia Fortress was. If the Temple Mount remains represent those of the Antonia, then it would have been utterly impossible to destroy it in only 7 days. I had a picture for that. We'll see. I'll try to get back to it. The rocky platform on which the Antonia was built can still be seen at the northwest corner of the temple. You can still see the remains of it. Okay? I do not know of any serious archaeologist or historian who would place the Antonia elsewhere or to make it that big. Despite the destruction of the walls of the fortress by Titus, the rocky Antonia Plateau continued to play a strategic role in the subsequent battle for the Temple Mount. I wish I had that picture. I don't have that picture. Hang on, I can figure it out. Let's see. Give me a second. I want to show you the picture. This is a big point. One of the temple. I have it on my computer if I don't have it in this teaching. Okay, there we go. There it is. That's what I was looking for. Okay, so here's the Antonia Fortress over here. This is where the temple was. He's saying this was this big. Right? Can you imagine if that's at least 5 times bigger than this. If this was this whole area, there is no way it could have been torn down in 7 days. Absolutely impossible. Okay? Let me go back. Almost done here. And like I said, these are just a few things. All the mikvahs that were up there. The third temple being submerged in water when the Mount of Olives splits in half. The size of the Antonia Fortress would have to be. Okay. We did that. In the midst. Okay, here we go. Actually, about 10 times bigger. The size of the Temple Mount is approximately 10 times that of the Antonia. If the Temple Mount remains represent those of the Antonia, then it would have been utterly impossible to destroy it in 7 days. The rock Antonia did that. Yes. So Josephus writes that the commander of the 5th Legion directed some of the later attacks from this commanding height, from the Antonia Fortress. So how could they be tearing it down while he's standing there commanding? You know, everything else to be done. It's ridiculous. And Titus oversaw the final destruction of the temple from the same elevated spot. You can read that in Jewish Wars 6. Josephus mentions the demolition of the Antonia for the last time in Jewish Wars 6:311. So there are many other proofs. I mean, we could do this literally for weeks. There's many different proofs I could interject into this teaching. These are just a few of them. Far, far enough to convince any rational person to accept its facts. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the teaching. I got to leave immediately after, so I won't get to chat with you. I have to go rent a truck, so I got to run. Hope you enjoyed that, though.
Safe
Shabbat
travels,
shalom.
Rabbi.
What's that?
Safe travels.
Thank you very much. I got to get